Right now, you are the only human species on the entire planet. That sentence sounds obvious, almost too obvious to say out loud, but it's actually one of the strangest facts in the story of life on Earth. For most of the last 6 million years, more than one kind of human walked this planet at the same time. Sometimes 3. Sometimes 4. Sometimes 5, in different valleys, different continents, different corners of the same world you live in now. And today, there's just you. One species. One version of human, spread across every landmass, with nothing else even remotely like it left standing. That should feel stranger than it does. Every other successful branch of life on Earth tends to splinter, not consolidate. Beetles didn't narrow down to one species. Neither did cats, or birds, or ants. Diversity is usually the story evolution tells. Somehow, in our case, the opposite happened. Every other kind of human that ever existed is gone, and only one branch made it to right now, sitting exactly where you are, reading exactly this sentence. The obvious explanation is that we were simply better. Smarter, tougher, more adaptable, and the others just couldn't keep up. That story is comforting, and it's also almost certainly incomplete. Because some of those other human species weren't struggling stragglers barely holding on. Some of them had bigger brains than yours. Some of them survived ice ages that would have wiped out entire modern cities. One of them existed for close to 2 million years, nearly 10 times longer than Homo sapiens has existed so far. If this were purely a story about superiority, the timeline doesn't add up cleanly, and that gap between the story we tell and the evidence we've actually dug out of the ground is exactly where this gets interesting. Start with the species most people have actually heard of. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia for roughly 400,000 years, hunting large game, controlling fire, burying their dead, and surviving ice age winters that dropped temperatures far below anything most of us will ever experience. For decades, the popular image was a lumbering, dim-witted brute, a caricature more than a species. Genetic research overturned that image almost completely. Geneticist Svante Pääbo led the team that first sequenced the Neanderthal genome, a project significant enough to win him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, and what that genome revealed wasn't a separate, failed experiment of evolution. It was a close cousin, genetically compatible enough with Homo sapiens that the two species interbred, repeatedly, across thousands of years of overlapping contact. That single detail rewrites the entire narrative. If Neanderthals could not just coexist with modern humans but actually reproduce with them successfully, the old story of "we simply outcompete an inferior species" starts to crack. You are, right now, walking proof that this wasn't a clean replacement. Most people with European or Asian ancestry carry somewhere around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA today, quietly embedded in genes tied to immune function, skin, and hair. Extinction, in this case, wasn't total. Part of Neanderthal biology never actually left. It just stopped existing as a separate species and started existing as a fraction of you. But that raises an even stranger question. If they weren't simply outcompete, and part of their DNA survived by blending into ours, what actually happened to the rest of the population? Why did an entire lineage that had survived brutal ice ages for hundreds of thousands of years vanish within a few thousand years of sustained contact with Homo sapiens? The honest answer is that researchers don't have one single, clean cause. They have several overlapping pressures, and untangling which one mattered most is still an active argument in the field. Climate instability during that period was severe, with rapid temperature swings that stressed every large mammal population in Europe, humans included. Neanderthal groups also appear to have lived in smaller, more isolated bands than incoming Homo sapiens populations, which matters more than it sounds like it should. Smaller, isolated groups accumulate harmful genetic mutations faster and recover from bad years more slowly, something population geneticists sometimes compare to a small startup running out of runway during a rough quarter versus a massive company that can absorb the same loss without blinking. A population of a few thousand scattered Neanderthals simply had far less margin for error than the larger, more interconnected Homo sapiens networks spreading into the same territory. There's also the resource competition angle, and it's less dramatic than people expect. This likely wasn't a story of coordinated warfare and mass violence, despite how tempting that narrative is. Direct evidence of large-scale conflict between the two species is thin, almost startlingly thin given how enormous the outcome was. What the evidence does support is something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. Two species hunting the same herds, competing for the same caves, the same firewood, the same seasonal territory, over thousands of years, with one population holding a slight demographic and technological edge that compounded generation after generation. Not a war. A long, slow squeeze. Here's something worth sitting with. If the species most similar to us, capable of interbreeding with us, sharing fire and shelter and possibly even ideas with us, still couldn't survive alongside us long term, what does that suggest about every other human species that was less similar, and had even less overlap with the world we were building? Let me know what you think in the comments. Because Neanderthals were far from the only branch that disappeared, and some of the others vanished under circumstances that are even harder to fully explain. Thousands of kilometers east of the Neanderthal range, deep in a cave system in Siberia, researchers found something in 2008 that didn't match Neanderthal DNA or modern human DNA. It came from a tiny finger bone and a couple of teeth, found in what's now called Denisova cave. The species built entirely from that fragmentary evidence became known as the Denisovans, and almost everything known about them comes from genetics rather than a complete skeleton, which is itself a strange kind of extinction. An entire population, reduced in the archaeological record to a few bone fragments small enough to fit in your palm. What genetics revealed about Denisovans is arguably stranger than anything found about Neanderthals. Certain populations in Melanesia and parts of Southeast Asia carry significant Denisovan ancestry today, in some groups reaching 4 to 6% of their genome. And one specific inherited gene, called EPAS1, appears to have come directly from Denisovan ancestors into modern Tibetan populations, helping them process oxygen efficiently at extreme high altitude. A species that no longer exists is still, quietly, helping people breathe on mountains today. That's not metaphorical. That's measurable biology, sitting inside living human bodies right now. Denisovans and Neanderthals themselves interbred too, based on genetic evidence from a bone fragment identified as belonging to a first-generation hybrid individual, offspring of a Neanderthal mother and Denisovan father. For a while, at least in that corner of Siberia, the boundaries between human species weren't rigid walls. They were more like overlapping circles, populations blending into each other in ways that complicate any clean story of one species simply winning and the others simply losing. And still, despite all of that overlap and interbreeding, the Denisovans, like the Neanderthals, eventually stopped existing as a distinct population. The same pattern seems to repeat: contact, coexistence, interbreeding, and then a slow fade into absorption or disappearance, rather than a dramatic single ending. Move far enough east, past continental Asia entirely, onto an isolated island called Flores in modern Indonesia, and the story gets even stranger. In 2003, researchers excavating a cave called Liang Bua uncovered the remains of an adult human standing roughly 1 meter tall, with a skull and brain size dramatically smaller than any known adult Homo sapiens. The species was named Homo floresiensis, and it earned an immediate, almost irresistible nickname in the press, the Hobbit. What makes Homo floresiensis genuinely disorienting isn't just the size. It's the timeline. Current evidence suggests this tiny human species may have survived on that island until roughly 50,000 years ago, meaning it likely overlapped, at least loosely, with early Homo sapiens populations moving through the region. An isolated island population, evolved down to a fraction of typical human height, likely shrinking over generations due to limited resources on the island, a well-documented evolutionary pattern called insular dwarfism that also produced dwarf elephants on the very same island. Nobody knows with certainty why Homo floresiensis eventually disappeared. A massive volcanic eruption in the region around that same period is one leading candidate. Encounter with expanding Homo sapiens populations is another. The truthful answer researchers give, when pressed, is that the evidence is too sparse to say for certain, and that admitting the gap is more honest than filling it with confident guesswork. Let's be honest about something that matters here, because this entire topic tempts people toward tidy, satisfying conclusions the evidence doesn't fully support. It's genuinely difficult, sometimes impossible, to prove exactly how a species vanished tens of thousands of years ago from the physical evidence that survives. Bones decay. Most individuals who ever lived left no fossil trace at all. Entire populations are sometimes represented by a single tooth, a solitary fragment of jaw. Scientists studying these extinctions aren't hiding a clean answer. In most cases, an unambiguous single cause simply isn't recoverable from what remains, and any documentary or video that claims total certainty about exactly how a species died out is almost always overstating the evidence. The most rigorous position, and the one this video is trying to hold, is that we can identify contributing pressures with real confidence, while admitting that the precise, final sequence of events for any one of these species is still genuinely unresolved. There's a fourth species that complicates the picture even further, and it's one of the most recently discovered. In South Africa's Rising Star Cave system, a research team led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger uncovered, starting around 2013, the remains of a species now called Homo naledi. Small-brained, roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee's brain, yet found deep inside an extraordinarily difficult-to-access chamber, reachable only through narrow passages requiring deliberate, careful navigation. Some researchers argue this suggests naledi individuals were deliberately placing their dead in that chamber, a form of ritual behavior previously assumed to require a much larger brain to even conceive of. That interpretation remains contested within the field, and it's worth saying plainly that not every paleoanthropologist agrees with it. But even the possibility reframes something important. Brain size alone was never the whole story of what made a human species behaviorally complex, and species with far smaller brains than yours may have been doing things inside those caves that still aren't fully understood. And underneath all of these separate stories sits one single species that outlasted every other human lineage by an almost absurd margin. Homo erectus emerged roughly 2 million years ago and, depending on which population you're tracking, some evidence suggests certain groups may have survived until as recently as 100,000 years ago on the island of Java. Do the math on that for a second. Homo sapiens, your species, has existed for somewhere around 300,000 years. Homo erectus potentially persisted for close to 2 million. If survival alone were the measure of evolutionary success, Homo erectus wasn't a footnote in this story. It was, for most of human history, the main character, and everyone else, including you, was still waiting in the wings. So if endurance like that was possible, what finally ended it? The honest answer, again, is layered rather than singular. Climate shifts over that enormous span of time repeatedly reshaped available habitat. Competition from more recently evolved human species, including eventually Homo sapiens, likely added pressure in the later stretches of its existence. And simple demographic bad luck, small isolated populations failing to recover from environmental shocks, probably played a role that's almost impossible to fully reconstruct from fossils alone. Here's the twist buried underneath every one of these individual stories, and it's the part that reframes the entire question you started this video with. You didn't inherit an empty world that other human species simply failed to hold on to. You inherited a world where at least some of those species partially became you. Neanderthal genes in your immune system if your ancestry traces through Europe or Asia. Denisovan genes helping some populations breathe at extreme altitude. The disappearance of these species wasn't purely subtraction. In several documented cases, it was also a kind of absorption, biology folding into biology across thousands of years of contact most people never think about. That reframes what extinction even means in this specific context. It's tempting to imagine a clean line between species that survived and species that vanished, with Homo sapiens standing triumphant on one side. The genetic evidence suggests something messier and, honestly, more interesting. The line was porous. Populations mixed, competed, sometimes cooperated, and eventually most branches thinned out while one lineage kept growing, kept spreading, kept adapting to more environments than any of its relatives ever managed. Why did that one branch, your branch, end up the one still standing? Researchers point to a cluster of traits working together rather than any single silver bullet explanation. Homo sapiens developed extensive long-distance trade networks earlier and more consistently than other human species show clear evidence for, moving materials like shells and pigments hundreds of kilometers from their source. That kind of network does something subtle but powerful. It connects populations that would otherwise be isolated, spreading genetic diversity, spreading ideas, spreading solutions to local problems across a much wider group than any single band could manage alone. Imagine the difference between a single household trying to survive a crisis completely alone, versus a household that's part of a huge, interconnected community sharing resources, information, and support. Isolated Neanderthal bands were closer to that lone household. Interconnected Homo sapiens populations were closer to the community. Symbolic behavior may have compounded that advantage further. Evidence of personal ornamentation, complex toolkits, and possibly early representational art appears more consistently and more widely across Homo sapiens sites than at comparable Neanderthal or Denisovan sites, though this remains an actively debated area, with some evidence of symbolic behavior found at Neanderthal sites too, complicating any simple story of one species having culture and the other lacking it entirely. What does seem clearer is scale and consistency, not the mere existence of the capability. Population size itself may have simply been the deciding factor more than any single cognitive advantage. Genetic evidence suggests Homo sapiens populations expanding out of Africa were, in many regions, substantially larger and more genetically diverse than the Neanderthal and Denisovan populations they encountered. Larger populations recover from bad years faster. They innovate more, purely through having more individuals generating more attempts at solving the same problems. They're harder to wipe out through localized disasters. None of that required Homo sapiens to be individually smarter than a Neanderthal. It required Homo sapiens to exist, cumulatively, in greater numbers with better connected networks, which is a very different kind of advantage than the story of individual genius most people imagine. And this is where the story stops being only about extinct species, and starts being about the fragility of what you're currently part of. You are not the guaranteed endpoint of some inevitable evolutionary triumph. You are the surviving branch of a family tree that, for most of its history, had multiple branches at once, several of which were, by many measures, doing just fine right up until they weren't. Homo erectus survived for 2 million years and still eventually disappeared. Homo floresiensis adapted successfully to an isolated island for tens of thousands of years and still eventually disappeared. Being well adapted to your current environment has never been a permanent guarantee against a changing one. Think about it like this: every other human species that ever existed was, at some point in its history, the most successful human species on the planet, exactly as you are right now. None of them knew they were living through their species' final chapters. There was no warning sign, no dramatic final scene. Populations simply got smaller, generation by generation, until one day there weren't enough individuals left to sustain the next one, and nobody alive at that moment necessarily understood they were witnessing an ending. That should sit uncomfortably, and it's meant to, at least a little. Not because extinction is imminent for Homo sapiens in any immediate sense. Current population numbers make that comparison genuinely misleading, but because the pattern underneath every one of these disappearances is a reminder that dominance in one era has never once translated into permanence. Every branch on this family tree believed, in whatever way a species without language for the concept can believe anything, that its way of surviving would keep working. For a while, it always did. Until, eventually, for reasons that were sometimes climate, sometimes competition, sometimes simple demographic bad luck, it stopped working, and the branch went quiet. You carry pieces of at least two of those branches inside your own cells right now, whether you've ever thought about it or not. If tracing the hidden connections between extinct human species and the body you're living in right now is the kind of thing that keeps pulling you back, subscribe. Next time we're tracing why your ancestors' encounter with Neanderthals may have reshaped your immune system in ways doctors are still mapping today. Somewhere in your DNA, quietly, without asking permission, a species that stopped existing tens of thousands of years ago is still doing its job, and you are, right now, the only human species left standing to notice.